let's talk about analyzing qualitative interviews. Now, I'm specifically looking at interviews here just because that's typically the most common form of qualitative data, at least that I've researched or in my research. But I do acknowledge that there are many different kinds of qualitative data. There's images and videos and everything else, and all of that is valid forms of data, but I don't really want to get into that because the analysis can just be tricky. There's tons of books out there about it, and if you think you need a separate video on how to analyze images as a form of qualitative data, let me know and I'll put that video out there. But now we're just going to focus on interviews as a form of qualitative data. Now, first thing I do whenever I get an interview is make sure that I take notes after the interview. So even if it's a day after, sit down and think about the interview and write out a couple of sentences, a short summary, maybe key points from that interview. Don't write bullets. I always find that bullets end up being too short and not easy to understand at a later date after you've done that interview. So make sure you're actually writing full sentences describing what that person talked about, what you think is interesting, and maybe go ahead and start relating what they've said to what you know from the research literature. That can be a really important piece of your analysis. Now, you've gotten your interview, you've got your field notes after the interview. Next step, I would say, is to transcribe that interview. Now, I know that can be incredibly boring and dull and horrible because you have a 1-hour interview and it might take you better part of 4, 5, 6 hours to transcribe it. In my doctorate, I think I conducted some 50 odd interviews, and it took me about 4 hours per interview. I used to do 2 interviews per day at work, and it was torture. It took me forever to get through it, but you know what I got out of it was a deeper understanding of the data. I got a deeper understanding of what that person was saying because it wasn't just doing the interview and then having somebody else transcribe it and then going in and reading the transcription. It gave me a more in-depth understanding because I had to go kind of with them and with me as the researcher, word by word through what they were saying to try to understand a little bit better. It also gives you the opportunity while you're transcribing to take another set of notes to say, ooh, at 1 minute, 35 seconds, this person said something really, really interesting. So note that down so that you can go back when you're doing your analysis and pick that up. I think it's really important, especially for early stage researchers, to take the opportunity to transcribe their own interviews. Again, I know it's torture, but it can really, really, really benefit you. Even if you're doing 20 or 30 or 40 interviews, go for it. It's worth the investment in your time. Now, you may choose to get some of them transcribed and transcribe some of them yourself. Fine, I'm not going to judge you for it, but I do think it's important that you try to transcribe as many as possible. So now you have your interview transcribed. You have word for word or close to word for word what the person said. Now, I say close to because it's really important, I think, as a person who's transcribed a lot of interviews, you don't necessarily need to catch every blah, or any noise that person says, or especially anything that you say. The things that you say are not nearly as important as the things that the person says. So often I'll just skip over anything that I've said in the interview, and I'll just note what they've said. And of course, if they have any hiccups, anything that they've said that doesn't quite come out in words, just skip over it and move into the next piece of text. What matters here is the substance of what they're saying. That's what you're going to be quoting. That's what you're going to be bringing across in your analysis, and what you want the reader to understand when you present your research results. Now, if for whatever reason the interview participant saying at a certain point in time is really important for your analysis, then of course include it. But generally speaking, those sorts of kind of aren't really as important as the rest of the interview that you're conducting. So now you have your transcription kind of cleaned up. It looks really good. Now, the next step that I usually do is I'll go through and I'll just write a 1-paragraph summary of the key insights of the interview. Now, this differs from your field notes. Now, your field notes are really just your first impressions, but if you've transcribed the interview, now you have one step beyond just first impressions. You have a much more in-depth understanding of the interview. So I'd write another paragraph summary of what this interview is all about. What are the key issues that the person is talking about? What are your key reflections and insights in relation to the literature that this person is saying, so that you can begin to develop your analysis, begin to develop your understanding of what they have said. Now, you'll have a whole bunch of interviews now transcribed. You'll have your initial summary. You'll have your summary after you've done your transcription, and you have a set of interviews, however many there are. Next key step here is really getting into the nitty gritty of what they have said. And this is a form of analysis called thematic analysis. And this is kind of par for the course when it comes to qualitative research and especially qualitative interview research. So I go through then each interview. And the minute the person says something of substance, I highlight it, and I often do this in hard copy, so I'll actually print out all of the interview transcripts and make sure they're all together, make sure they're in the right order, like the pages are in the right order, and make sure that you have each page kind of tagged in the header somewhere with the person's ID number so that you know that this quote belonged to that person. So then I'll go through and I'll highlight, and I'll get like 10 or 15 different colored markers, and I'll just boom, 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 highlight every key idea that the person's bringing across. Now, it may be that in like one paragraph of a transcription, the person talks about 3 or 4 different ideas. Fine, that's 3 or 4 different colors, the way I would do it. It may be that they talk about 2 paragraphs about one idea. Okay, then that becomes one color. Now, this process evolves over time, so you're going to kind of have to feel it out. When you start doing an analysis of an interview, the things that you're highlighting, the text segments, may be different than how you end that same interview. So you may have to go back to the beginning again and go, oh, wait a minute, this is actually not supposed to be pink, it's supposed to be blue. This is not supposed to be red, it's supposed to be orange. And you can go back and kind of fix it up. Once you have everything highlighted in an interview or in all of your interviews, what I usually go back through and do is just write a couple of key words after each highlight. So if I've highlighted the first thing in blue, I'll sit down and say, okay, what are 2 or 3 words that describe what this blue section is about? And then as you do that through every other color and you're going through interview after interview, some things are going to start recurring. You're going to get recurring themes that come up, and you're going to realize, oh, wait, this person A talked about this issue in this way. This person B talked about the same issue, but in a different way. Now you have what's called a theme that you can start to cross-reference across a series of interviews or even other qualitative data, like policies or laws or whatever else. So now you have a whole bunch of interviews that are all highlighted, that are categorically kind of labeled. And what I usually do at this point, and again, you can probably do all of this digitally. I have done a small number of interviews like this digitally, but if I have a large number, I really do print them all out and highlight with actual highlighters. I then take a pair of scissors and I start cutting out all the quotes. Now again, make sure that when you start cutting out quotes, that each quote is tagged with some sort of identification number so you know who it belongs to, because you don't want to have to try to cross-reference an interview quote from a whole body of interviews that are like 20 or 30 interviews. So now you have a whole bunch of text segments that are highlighted, you have them categorized, and you have them labeled with the person who said it, and then you have them all cut up, and then I just sit there and match the colors, right? So just lay them all out, each category, each color, the way it should look, or the way it, together. So now you have themes that you've laid out in different colors, labeled with one category per theme, more or less, and then an individual's name or identity number tagged to each of those quotes. Now you have the beginning of an analysis. Now you may end up with 10, 15, 20 different themes or categories that you've identified, or different colors, and that's fine, all right? This is just the first step. So what I usually do at that point is I take each of the colored themes and I start looking at the individual quotes, and I just start ordering them, right? I take them from kind of broad level issues, and then I bring them down to narrower and more concrete level issues. So things they might have talked on an abstract level about that belong to that theme or that category, and then things that they talk about in a very specific concrete way down towards the bottom. So I start broad, go down narrower and more concrete. Then what you have is a kind of a body of work that a lot of people or several of your participants may have talked about in different ways, which is great. You may find that you can then create subcategories out of that general theme. So if all of those quotes are highlighted in blue and they all belong to idea category theme A, you might be able to break out subcategories, sub-ideas within that A.1, A.2, A.3 or something like that. So that way you have a better structure to the data, to the analysis of of the data. So maybe 3 participants talked about topic A in this way, 2 participants talked about topic A in a slightly different way, and then 1 participant talked about topic A in a completely different way. So that kind of sets you up for a structure for your analysis, especially when you're beginning to write it up. Now you may start to find also that all your blue highlights and all your green highlights are actually the same. And so then you might just group all of them together. You may find that all your blue highlights and 2 of your green highlights actually relate to each other. And then there may only be 1 green highlight left over here. So there's going to be data that you're going to have to toss out at the end of the day. And that's normal for qualitative research. So in quantitative research traditions, you almost have to account for all the data, outliers, and everything in between. In qualitative research, we're really trying to focus here in on primary and secondary themes that have emerged throughout the data set. So there's going to be data that gets just left on the table that you kind of have to resign yourself to archiving in some way so that you have access to it at a later date, of course anonymized and everything like that, but that doesn't make it into your final dissertation or your final master's thesis or even a paper that you're writing. So now you have all the interview transcripts, you have them all categorized according to themes, you have them organized, and everything's kind of well laid out for you. The next step then is taking that and putting them into the themes that you want to focus in on in whatever writing and in whatever paper or thesis that you are trying to produce. So that will mean that you have to kind of focus in on a few things rather than all the things, and make sure that you have the data that is most relevant and most important to your topic. In any interview, you're going to end up in a situation where people have said a whole lot of things to you that maybe it's only 10 or 20% of the interview data that you actually use from that specific interview. And that's totally fine. Even within those themes, you might have 10 or 15, 20 quotes, but you're only able to use 2 or 3 of those key quotations in your final write-up. So that may mean that the other quotations that are just variations on a theme, you can just say use 1 key quotation and refer to the other participants whenever you're writing it up. So you can say 3 participants mentioned something about this topic and then use one of those quotations as an example of what that topic is. So that's just a little brief on how you can analyze qualitative data. It's kind of very procedural, but it can help you if you're very structured in the way that you go about that. So again, from the first instance, make sure that you type out all of your interviews, you transcribe everything. Secondly, I print everything out and I highlight according to major ideas that come out in a specific passage. That may be 1 sentence, that may be 1 phrase within a sentence, or it may be paragraph upon paragraph. Then break all those elements up into, put them all into like categories. So if you have all your blue highlights, put all those together, organize them into some structured way, and then you have the basis of your analysis so that you can use that for your write-up.